says it's determined to press for President Omar al-Bashir to become the African Union's next chairman. But that's not going to be easy when the 53-member AU tries to select a new chairman in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa this week. As Jeff Koinange reports, one issue presents a major stumbling block to Mr. Bashir's candidacy.
Assalamu alaikum.
If there ever was an irony on a continent filled with ironies, here's one that really takes the prize. The African Union, the Organization of Nations on the continent, appears ready to appoint this man, Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir, as its new chairman. What's the big deal, you might ask? Bashir heads the country the United Nations says is home to the world's worst humanitarian crisis, Darfur. The section in the west of Sudan where the United Nations says more than 200,000 people have been brutally killed the past 4 years, more than 10 times that made homeless by an Arab militia known as the Janjaweed, a militia many accuse Bashir's government of sponsoring. The United States and other Western nations say it's genocide.
It's difficult to see how President Bashir can play an independent mediation role outside of Sudan if his role is really, if he's party to a conflict inside the Sudan. And there has been a lot of concern inside and outside of Africa exactly of this issue of Sudan coming in as the chair of the African Union.
Human rights groups are up in arms, saying Bashir becoming AU chairman is a slap in the face of everything the organization stands for. But some analysts insist there are other pressing issues in Sudan than Bashir's chairmanship.
The reality is that the chairman of the AU is a ceremonial position. The focus must be on the welfare of the people of Sudan, on the solution of the problems of Sudan. And by making President Bashir chairman, the AU voting him chairman will not stop those processes.
Despite a global outcry and a call for international peacekeepers, Bashir has repeatedly said Darfur is an internal matter. He's opposed the presence of any foreign troops in Darfur, despite the fact that UN troops are in southern Sudan, keeping peace in that fragile region. It was only after a lot of international pressure that Bashir recently reluctantly agreed to extend the present African Union mandate in Darfur. Critics argue as AU chairman, Bashir would have absolute power to control what happens and what doesn't happen in Darfur.
If Sudan gets the chair of the African Union, it will send a very negative message. It will be a big disappointment for many.
More than a dozen aid workers have been killed in Darfur the past year alone. Western aid agencies have all but abandoned relief operations there, just when the people of Darfur need it so desperately.
For me as an African, the critical issue is to overcome the conflict in Sudan. Will the chairmanship by Bashir of the AU stop the processes that are now in process? The answer is no. So I think we shouldn't get carried away by the convoluted messages from outsiders out of Africa.
Twice, Bashir's name has come up for the chairmanship of the AU the past couple of years, and both times he's been rejected. But this time around, the continent's leaders may find themselves running out of excuses. One Africa analyst says maybe the AU should just give Bashir the chairmanship. After all, he says, how much worse can the situation in Darfur get? But that's exactly what most of the world doesn't want to find out. Jeff Koinange, CNN, Pretoria, South Africa.
Well, amid the growing international opposition to Mr. al-Bashir's candidacy, Dapo Oyewole joins me with some perspective on that issue. And he's the Executive Director of the Centre for African Policy and Peace Strategy, or CAPS. Good morning to you. Good to have us with you this morning. How likely do you think it is that Mr. al-Bashir is going to be sworn in as the chairman?
Well, we're really uncertain as it now, and the indications are or point to the direction of either Ghana or Tanzania coming up as opposed to Sudan. But I think, you know, like your colleague said, Jeff, it's not only an irony, it would be a great travesty. I mean, we should bear in mind that Khartoum, the government of Khartoum, has some of its officials being investigated by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. They failed to protect civilians. They gave even the African Union a very hard time in extending the mandate of the African Union troops in there. And most importantly, if Bashir on Sudan should become the chair of the African Union, it will put African Union troops in Darfur in arm's way, because the rebel forces have said they will no longer be neutral parties in the conflict, and therefore they'll be fair target for attacks.
So if Sudan does take up the chairmanship, others are likely to walk out of the African Union, is that right?
Well, Chad has come out and said clearly that if that happens, that they are going to step back. And many countries in Central Africa, in West Africa, in Southern Africa, and even internationally have come out to say that they strongly are against this. And we find that even the normal supporters of Sudan, like Libya, for example, are also backtracking. So I think the message is on the wall. This should not happen. The African government should not let it happen.
How does it actually help Sudan, though, if they're excluded again from the chairmanship, because they have been excluded twice? How does it help the situation in Darfur?
Well, it wouldn't help at all. And I think what everyone is saying is that for Sudan to become the chair of the African Union would actually worsen the situation in Darfur. We need to put this in context. It will give Sudan great powers. And it's very much like asking Sudan to become the judge in its own trial.
Human rights groups have been very anti-Sudan taking on the chairmanship, haven't they? They've said it will discredit the office. Do you think that's the case? It will not only discredit the African Union and the great work it's been doing in trying to reshape the political, social and economic landscape in Africa, particularly in the area of governance, but it will not only discredit it, it will discredit the image of Africa internationally as well. So I do agree. So what do you expect to happen then in Addis Ababa this week? What are you expecting the outcome to be? Well, as often what we see on TV is not exactly what is going on. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes diplomacy going on between different governments, and they're trying to convince Sudan to step down. All the indication as at now is that Sudan has not acceded to that suggestion, but I think in the interest of Africa and in the interest of resolving the conflict in not only in Darfur but also in Somalia and different parts of Africa, Sudan should step down. Now, there is a possibility, isn't there, of a joint African Union and UN force to go into Darfur. Do you think that's likely to be agreed to? Well, again, Sudan has been one of the stumbling blocks in ensuring that we can get this strong, robust international hybrid force of AU troops and UN troops in Darfur to be able to protect civilians. And that is one of the points. How can we expect Sudan to actually chair the African Union when it's the one undermining this? So we do hope that, that in this instance, that Sudan will not become the chair. And perhaps one very interesting point is that maybe some analysts have said maybe if Sudan should actually chair the African Union, then it's put in the spotlight, and therefore it would actually not be able to become be as difficult as it's been. But all indications are that that might not be what would happen. We can't take that chance. Okay, Dapo Oyewole, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Pleasure.
The African Union has backed Sudan's rejection of United Nations peacekeepers being deployed in the war-torn Darfur region. The AU chairman, Alpha Omar Kanari, made the announcement after a meeting with Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir. Last November, Bashir's government appeared to agree to a hybrid force with UN peacekeepers augmenting poorly equipped AU troops. But despite continued violence, Sudan insists the 7,000 African force is strong enough.
Our understanding of the hybrid force is very clear. The contribution from the United Nations shall be in the areas of administration, logistics and technical aspects.
Well, Dapo Oyewole is the Executive Director of the Centre for African Policy and Peace Strategy, and he joins us now from London. Mr. Oyewole, as we heard there, President Omar al-Bashir appears to be backtracking on an agreement to deploy a hybrid UN-AU force to the region. But what are the implications of the African Union supporting this decision?
Well,
we're in a situation, I think the African Union is in a situation whereby they find that they're unable to move forward without coming to some form of agreement. And this deadlock, as you know, has been there since August in 2006. Now, what did happen in November is that the government of Sudan said, okay, fine, they would agree to the hybrid force, which will see about 17,000 UN troops and about 3,000 additional police to be able to have a robust force in Darfur. But unfortunately, they are now saying that any foreign troops, any UN troops in Darfur will be can be equated to foreign occupation of Sudan, and the Sudanese are very proud. But I think what the African Union is trying to do at this instance is to ensure that whichever way, whether it's an AU force or a UN hybrid force, that we have people on the ground in Sudan protecting the lives of the many civilians that have been open to all kinds of atrocities in that region.
Now, talks on UN forces being deployed to the region seem to be ongoing. If UN troops are deployed, what do you think the actual size of the force will be, and what will their rules of engagement be?
Well, what was initially agreed, like I mentioned, will be something in the region about 17,000 soldiers and about 3,000 additional civilian and also police to help to ensure that there is safety and security. But I think the key challenge that we're looking at here is that if the Sudanese government insists that any troops, any peacekeeping troops in Sudan must be under an African command and must be an African force, the question really would be, if we were to upgrade the African Union forces from 7,000, where will these forces come from, especially bearing in mind that the AU is really quite stretched with the events in Somalia?
Exactly. I mean, you say that the AU is already quite stretched, and we have continuing reports of violence and human rights abuses in Darfur and the surrounding area. Why has the process of defining, of actually coming to an agreement of having UN troops, peacekeepers deployed, why has this process taken so long?
Because UN peacekeepers cannot be deployed in Sudan without the clear agreement of the government of Sudan. Anything different from that itself can be seen as a form of aggression, and in that scenario, the UN forces in Sudan will be otherwise legitimate targets, and the militia, the Janjaweed militia themselves, have come out to say that there are UN peacekeeping troops in Sudan, that there will be a fair game to be attacked. So that is the first challenge. The second issue really is that the African Union must keep its communication channels and its ability to influence the government of Sudan open. Therefore, they're between a rock and a hard place, so to speak. They would ordinarily like to see the UN peacekeeping troops in Sudan, because they know that is the only way in which we can be able to ensure that there's peace and stability in that region. But if they are to stand against the government of Sudan in this instance, then nothing at all will be done, and would only count the cost of that in the lives of ordinary civilians. So that really is the deadlock that we need to unravel.
Dapo Oyewole, Executive Director of the Centre for African Policy and Peace Strategy, thank you very much for your analysis.
Violent protests have marred this year's Miss Nepal beauty contest.